Consciousness poses a unique problem for neuroscience. The term itself is ambiguous, referring to dozens of different mental phenomena. Because standard definitions are so vague, it becomes nearly impossible to map them onto precise biological structures. To create a rigorous framework, philosopher David Chalmers divides the phenomena of consciousness into two distinct categories. The first category is what he calls the easy problems. The easy problems concern specific cognitive abilities. These include discriminating between environmental stimuli, integrating information from different senses, the focus of attention, and verbally reporting internal mental states. They are considered easy strictly in a relative sense. Explaining them requires decades of difficult empirical work, but we know exactly how to solve them. They are straightforwardly vulnerable to explanation through computational and neural mechanisms. The second category is the hard problem. This is the problem of subjective experience. When our sensory systems process a wavelength of light, there is a mechanical whir of data processing. But there is also a subjective aspect, an inner, felt quality of redness. We can track the data processing from the retina to the visual cortex, detailing every synaptic relay. Yet a complete map of those mechanics leaves the central mystery entirely untouched. It gives us no insight into why that processing goes on with an inner feel, rather than in the dark. Reductive scientific methods are designed to explain functions. If you want to explain a biological trait, you isolate the physical mechanism that performs that function. To explain the gene, scientists needed to specify the mechanism that stores and transmits hereditary information. Once they mapped the structure of DNA and showed how it performs that transmission, the gene was fully explained. There was no remaining mystery about what a gene was. This same functional method works perfectly for complex cognition. If you map the neural circuits that modify behavioral capacities in light of new information, you have successfully explained learning. The same applies to memory and language. But applying this method to subjective experience hits a wall. Experience defies functional reduction. You can explain the complete mechanism for how a brain categorizes an object and still be left with the question of why the organism actually feels what it is categorizing. This disconnect is called the explanatory gap. A detailed account of a neural function stays on one side of the gap, while the subjective reality of experience sits isolated on the other. To make empirical progress, cognitive science requires a structural shift. The field must abandon the search for a single, unified mechanism of consciousness and instead recognize that the brain operates using two entirely distinct architectures. Moving forward means geographically separating the cognitive function of accessing information from the raw biological reality of having an experience. Philosopher and cognitive scientist Ned Block argues that the brain does not possess a single neural correlate of consciousness, or NCC. Instead, the evidence points toward a dual NCC framework. The first architecture is the access NCC. This network relies heavily on the superior parietal and dorsolateral prefrontal cortices, operating as the brain's global workspace. The function of the access NCC is to broadcast information to consumer systems throughout the brain. This is the hardware responsible for memory, rational planning, and verbal reporting. It is the exact biological correlate for Chalmers' easy problems. The second architecture is the phenomenal NCC, the minimal neural basis generating the actual content of an experience. Take the subjective experience of visual motion. This requires localized activation in area V5, coupled with recurrent feedback loops sending signals back to the primary visual cortex, V1. Between these posterior sensory networks and the frontal access workspace, there is a tight informational bottleneck. Representations generated in the sensory cortex must engage in a strict winner-take-all competition to be broadcast forward to the cognitive centers. Because of this bottleneck, the two systems can be decoupled. A phenomenal sensory loop can physically fire in the back of the brain, creating a raw experience, and simultaneously lose the competition to reach the frontal workspace, meaning the subject has no ability to report that the experience occurred. This raises a severe methodological objection. If an experience never reaches the cognitive workspace and the subject cannot report it, how can science prove the experience actually happened? The answer relies on an empirical methodology known as signal detection theory, applied to macaque monkeys by neuroscientist Herman Super and his colleagues. The researchers trained macaques to perform a simple behavioral task. If a specific target figure appeared on a screen, the monkey would saccade, or move its eyes, to look at it, earning a reward. If no target appeared, the monkey was trained to maintain its forward fixation. While the monkeys performed this task, the researchers placed electrodes directly into V1, recording the live neural activity of the primary visual cortex. This graph shows neural activity recorded in V1. When processing a figure, there's an increased electrical response, this orange shaded area, or modulation. This is the neural signature of the macaque detecting the target, correlating perfectly with the monkey physically moving its eyes. Under highly salient, easy visual conditions, the biological systems align exactly. The phenomenal response and the access response fire in tandem. To test if these networks could be separated, the researchers made the task significantly harder. They decreased the visual saliency of the target by reducing the number of pixels, and they increased the frequency of trick-catch trials where no target was present. In signal detection theory, changing the difficulty or the reward structure alters the subject's internal decision criterion. The monkey requires a higher degree of confidence before it will commit to taking a physical action. As the conditions worsened, the behavioral results shifted. The monkeys began failing to saccade to the target figures, maintaining their forward fixation instead. The cognitive decision to act, the access NCC, was failing. Look at the rightmost graph. Even though the monkey made no behavioral response, the orange V1 modulation remained identical to successful trials. This isolates the phenomenal architecture on the sensory side of the brain, independent of frontal decision-making processes. By altering the threshold for action, the researchers successfully decoupled the phenomenal NCC from the access NCC. The data proves that a conscious percept, the raw biological instantiation of sensory data, exists fully formed in the cortex, even when it loses the winner-take-all competition for cognitive access. These primate studies expose a critical flaw in how human cognitive side of studies consciousness. Human trials rely heavily on the introspection trap. This is the deeply held experimental assumption that if a human subject verbally reports they did not see a stimulus, no phenomenal experience actually occurred. This assumption relies on a biological conflation. It treats the neural basis of having an experience as identical to the neural basis of forming a higher-order thought about that experience. There is a sharp distinction between simply having a raw, intransitive experience and possessing the cognitive articulation required to analyze and verbalize it. By relying exclusively on verbal reports, researchers filter their data through the frontoparietal bottleneck. They ensure they are only ever mapping the access workspace, ignoring the posterior sensory architecture where the actual phenomenological content resides. Treating introspective reportability as the unquestioned gold standard of evidence artificially restricts our map of the brain. It guarantees the hard problem remains unsolved by ensuring scientists look in the wrong place. The dual NCC framework represents a vital step forward. It takes a dense theoretical paradox and maps it directly onto distinct, verifiable neurobiological hardware. The frontoparietal network accounts entirely for the easy problems. It gives us the physical mechanism for information broadcasting, behavioral control, and reporting. Meanwhile, the posterior recurrent loops have been localized as the definitive physical determiners of phenomenal experience. Yet, a final limitation remains. Identifying a neural determiner establishes a physical correlation, but correlation does not equal explanation. We arrive back at Chalmers' original question. We know where the recurrent loop happens and the threshold conditions that trigger it, yet a mechanical description of area V5 interacting with V1 still does not explain why that loop inherently feels like visual motion. Final thought. Bloch's framework identifies the biological machinery of the hard problem, mapping exactly where the physical explanation ends. The transition from recurrent circuitry to a felt sensation remains unexplained by the hardware alone.